testifying against Paul Robeson. Robeson at Paris Peace Congress in April 1949, in a much misquoted statement, said something like, in view of the record as from his perspective of the Soviet Union's commitment to racial equality and due to the existence of racism within the United States, he didn't advise, how do I get that? He didn't, thank you. He didn't advise young blacks to evade the draft or to refuse to fight, whatever. He simply said it's unthinkable that young blacks in the United States would go to war against the Soviet Union. He later elucidated that to say he was talking in terms of peace and in terms of the struggle against colonialism. That was the context. In any case, Jackie Robinson did the best he could. If you go read his testimony, it's really, what he tried to do is he said, look, gentlemen, I disassociate myself from Paul Robeson and whatever silly things Paul Robeson wants to say. But unless you deal with the reality of racial injustice and discrimination in this country, there will always be Paul Robesons to speak out. And later, when Jackie was dying of diabetes and going blind, one of the last things he did was he told Roger Kahn, who was the author of the book The Boys of Summer, a wonderful book about the Brooklyn Dodgers of the 50s, that of all the regrets he ever had, that was his greatest regret. And then he put out, and toward the very end, an autobiography in which he said, this was already 1972, and he said that in view of the perpetual and deepening racial injustice in this country, he says the worst thing that he feels he ever did was to come out and attack Paul Robeson publicly. He never really attacked him. You know, like I said, I think he did the best he could under severe conditions of pressure. Okay, moving quickly to 1949. That woman sitting there talking to these kids at the summer camp, where I was a counselor at the age of 17 in 1949, a woman named Ada B. Jackson. I think Seren, you kind of circulated a very fine article which deals largely with Ada B. Jackson. She was a leader of the American Labor Party in Bedford-Stuyvesant and was a very, very effective public figure in fighting for job opportunities and against discriminatory housing. During the summer, she was the cook at Camp Chica, needed to make a living, but she also spent time talking to the kids and the like. And she was instrumental in an incident which I'll try to run through very quickly. The guy right there was probably the greatest influence on me, a guy named Morris Salt, who was one of the teachers at PS 35. That's Paul Robeson, for example, as you well know. And these are the kids at Camp Chica, an interracial left-wing camp. Before the season started in 1949, they had a meeting of the staff. This is all in the memoir aspect, that's why I'm going through this. Had a meeting of the staff, and one of the assignments was political action director. Well, in view of the fact that Ada B. Jackson was probably the most prominent and prestigious, I guess even the word, political figure associated with it, she was immediately nominated political action director. Now, she knew me as a kid running around the streets of Bed-Stuy, and she says, no, I can't do it. She's too busy cooking. She says, I nominate Solomon, I nominate Mark. Why don't make him political action? I didn't know what the hell political action director meant. I had no idea. Well, it turned out that that summer, the Smith Act trials were going on, the trials of communist leaders for teaching and advocating, mind you, the overthrow of the government. And so some of their children were at the camp, including the children of some of the lawyers. And George Crockett, who eventually became a member of Congress, his son was one of my campers, and Crockett was one of the lawyers for the Smith Act defenders. So I said, well, political action. I put up a sign in front of the mess hall saying, if anybody wants to contribute to funds, you know, for the legal defense of the Smith Act, people see me. Well, Morris, as he was called, the camp director and the administrator, a guy named Butch, who was the administrative director, they went ballistic. The camp itself was located in the northwest corner of the Jersey border, a very reactionary area. They had a big Quonset hut assembly hall called the Robeson Playhouse, And they had a big sign, Robeson Playhouse, out there. They're worried about that out there. They're worried about that sign even. But they're worried about physically being attacked in those days. So they saw what I did as a provocation. And man, I'm those callow 17-year-old kids. They come down on me, slamming away, accusing me of, and of endangering the very physical well-being of the camp. Well, Paul Robeson comes to the camp. Comes there every day, once a day, every summer. He referees a softball game. He sings for the children. And in the evening, he meets with the staff. So here's my opportunity, right? I never do that today. But I get they're asking him questions. They call him Paul. Everybody's on an informal basis. So I get up and, with a cracking voice, which I have now, like, hey, Paul, let's say you take a stand and you try to do the right thing, and they come crashing down on you and accusing you of all, I get all choked up. So he looks at me quizzically, and I will never, his response is deeply etched in my memory. He said, you have this wonderful voice in which I can't say, you have, we'll do the thing at the end, you have the same values, yeah, you have the same commitments, you have the same principles, yes, then it is incumbent upon you to sit down at the table and come together in unity, in solidarity. What else could I say? But that was my great encounter with Paul Robeson. This is the Progressive Party convention in Philadelphia in 1948. The Progressive Party, that itself is a long, long rap, and I won't bore you with it. But it actually started out with such high hopes. Especially the appeal that the party had to African Americans, because you had people like Robeson and Du Bois playing an incredibly prominent role in the leadership of what they called Gideon's Army. And you can see from the picture, actually, large numbers of African Americans at the founding convention. And Wallace, in the summer of 1948, had gone on a second Southern tour. He went on the first one before he declared for president. And there were lots of threats and physical threats of murder or bombing, but nothing seriously had happened. The second tour, however, in August of 1948, the violence against the Wallace movement that was attempting to get on the ballot in every state in the South was intense and brutal and so dangerous in certain places in the South. They had trouble getting out of cars for fear that Wallace would be shot. And Wallace himself, by the way, had adopted a tremendous sense of principled anti-racism and insisted that even in the deepest South, that every public meeting would have to be non-segregated, or they would move the venue to any place that they could be where they would not have segregation. And there were instances in which meetings were broken up. There were instances in which they had to make last-minute moves. And the feeling, the sense really of sympathy and support, particularly in black communities, for the Wallace movement was tremendous. And the feeling was maybe Wallace could get 4 to 6 million votes, and a legitimate, progressive, anti-Cold War, pro-economic justice, pro-civil rights third party could be established in this country. Well, a number of things happened. There was the Berlin blockade in the beginning of the summer of '48, which whipped up an anti-communist frenzy. There was the prosecution of the Communist Party leaders who were, at that point, heavily red-baited into the progressive vote. Harry Truman made the statement, "I'll have nothing to do with Henry Wallace and his communists." Wallace actually kind of courteously welcomed the communists into his movement because he wanted troops.